The royal palace of the Ivilian Empire stood tall against the backdrop of an alien world, its towering spires glistening under the light of distant stars. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension as King Zorith, ruler of the Ivilian people, prepared to make an announcement that would shake the entire empire to its core. His council had gathered, the room filled with whispers and anticipation. Few had ever seen the king's temper rise, but today was different. Today, his voice would command not just the room, but the fate of the galaxy itself. King Zorith sat at the head of the massive stone table, his gaze sharp and unyielding. His appearance was regal, tall, with skin the color of polished obsidian and eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. His presence was a force, and as he spoke, his voice boomed through the chamber. Enough. His command silenced the murmurs that had been spreading throughout the room. The council members, powerful and influential beings in their own right, sat still. "I have made my decision," Zorith continued, his voice colder than ice. "My daughters, the princesses of the Ivilian Empire, will marry a human." A stunned silence followed. The idea of an Ivilian princess marrying the human was beyond scandalous. Humans were considered primitive, weak, and utterly inferior in comparison to the mighty Ivilians. The species had barely begun exploring space and were still embroiled in wars and struggles for survival on their own planet. The mere suggestion that one of their daughters would be forced to marry a human was unthinkable. Lord Caden, the head of the royal advisors, was the first to recover from the shock. His face, usually calm and composed, now twisted with disbelief. He leaned forward, his voice trembling as he addressed the king. "Your Majesty, are you certain? A human. This is madness. They are nothing like us. They are weak, unrefined, and beneath you." Zorith's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "I know exactly what I am doing, Lord Caden. Do not question me." The king's voice was ice, each word cutting through the tension in the room. "This is not just a political alliance. This is something far more important. The humans are the key to the future of this galaxy, and I will have one of my daughters marry them." The room erupted into chaos as the council members began to argue amongst themselves. Some were horrified by the decree, while others seemed unsure whether to protest or accept it. The idea of such a powerful empire, built on strength, honor, and dominance, suddenly accepting humans, who were still seen as an insignificant race, was too much to comprehend. Among the chaos, Princess Zora, the youngest of the royal daughters, stood silently in the corner, listening to the heated debate. She was beautiful, tall, and graceful, with long silver hair that cascaded down her back. Her face was set in a quiet expression of disbelief. Zora had always known that her father, King Zorith, was a man of ambition. He ruled with an iron fist, making decisions that would change the course of history. But this was something she could never have imagined. Why would he do this? Why would he choose to marry her, or any of her sisters, to a human? Zora felt a mix of confusion and resentment building inside her. She had always been taught that Ivilians were the superior race. They had technology and power beyond any other species in the galaxy. They had conquered countless worlds, forged alliances, and built a legacy that would last for centuries. And now, her father was telling her that her future was to be tied to a human, a species she had always viewed as weak and beneath her. The debate continued, growing louder and more frantic, until the king's booming voice cut through the chaos once again. "Enough." Zorith's command echoed in the chamber, and instantly the room fell silent once more. His cold gaze swept over his council, each one silenced by the weight of his authority. "I have made my decision. The marriage will happen. It is not a suggestion, it is an order." Princess Zora's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her father, the mighty King Zorith, was willing to lower the honor of his daughters in such a way. To marry a human, it didn't make sense. Nothing about this felt right. And yet, as much as she wanted to protest, To defy the king's order, she knew she had no choice. She was a princess, and princesses did not question their fathers. At least, not publicly. Zora looked around the room, meeting the eyes of her sisters. They, too, were shocked, but none of them dared to speak out. This was their father's will. The king's authority was absolute. There was nothing they could do. Zora's thoughts turned to the human who would be chosen for this marriage. What kind of man would he be? What did he think of her people? Of her? Would he, too, see the marriage as an insult? Would he, like the rest of the galaxy, think of her as just another tool for political gain? Zora felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. She had been trained to rule, to lead with wisdom and strength. She had not been trained to be a pawn in her father's game of galactic politics. But one thing was certain: this marriage would change everything. It was just the beginning, and the galaxy would never be the same again. As Zora turned and left the chamber, her mind raced with questions and uncertainties. She had been ordered to marry a human, but who would she become in the process? And more importantly, what would happen to the Ivalian Empire if this alliance succeeded? The days following the king's decree were filled with whispers and uncertainty. Princess Zora could feel the weight of her father's decision pressing down on her every moment. The palace buzzed with preparations for the upcoming event, as the royal court began to organize the marriage of one of the princesses to a human. The idea still seemed incomprehensible to Zora, and as she wandered the marble halls of the palace, she could hear the hushed voices of her sisters in the court, all murmuring about the same thing: this strange, unexpected marriage. Zora found herself walking alone in the royal gardens, trying to clear her mind. The vibrant flowers and shimmering fountains of the palace grounds usually brought her peace, but today they only served to highlight the gnawing confusion in her heart. She had always been proud of her people, the Ivalians. They were a powerful, advanced race that had ruled the galaxy for centuries. How could her father, the great King Zorath, ask his daughters to marry a human? It was beneath them, beneath her. As she sat near a tranquil fountain, her thoughts turned to the human who was to be chosen. She had heard nothing about him. No name, no background, nothing. All she knew was that the king had summoned a human from Earth, a primitive planet far away, and had ordered his marriage to one of his daughters. Zora had always been taught that humans were inferior, barely even worthy of being part of the galactic community. They were a species still fighting wars on their own planet, struggling to survive, not yet capable of understanding the greater cosmic forces at play. How could one of these beings ever be a suitable match for a princess of the Ivalian Empire? Her mind kept racing back to the day of the council meeting. The way her father's face had been so determined when he made the decree, the coldness in his eyes as he silenced anyone who dared to question him. King Zorath was not a man who took his decisions lightly. When he spoke, people listened. And yet something about this decree didn't sit right with Zora. There was something her father wasn't telling them. Something hidden beneath the surface. The idea that humans could somehow bring balance to the galaxy seemed far-fetched at best and dangerous at worst. What could he possibly mean by that? Zora had always been the curious one. Unlike her sisters, who were content to follow their father's orders without question, she had always asked why. And this time, she couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling deep in her gut. There was more to this than just a political marriage. She felt a strange pull, an instinct urging her to uncover the truth. She couldn't help but wonder, what exactly did her father know about humans that no one else did? As days passed, Zora's curiosity turned into obsession. She began to quietly ask around, gathering bits and pieces of information wherever she could. Most of the palace staff were too afraid to speak openly, but here and there, she overheard whispers. Some of the guards spoke of the humans with a kind of fear, while others seemed dismissive, calling them weak and unimportant. But one servant, a young Ivalian woman who worked in the royal archives, spoke of a prophecy, a legend that had been passed down through generations, one that spoke of a human who would come to change the course of the galaxy. Zora was skeptical. She had never heard of such a prophecy before, but the more she thought about it, the more it seemed to fit her father's strange insistence on the human marriage. Could it be possible? Could this human truly hold some kind of power that no one had realized? Zora's mind was filled with questions, but there were no answers. At least not yet. One evening, as the royal family gathered for dinner, the tension in the air was palpable. Princess Zora sat across from her father, her eyes watching him carefully. He had been unusually quiet since his decree, and Zora couldn't help but notice how distant he seemed. For the first time in her life, she felt disconnected from him, as though he were no longer the man she had always looked up to. The king's cold gaze met hers across the table, and for a brief moment, Zora saw a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual stern expression. But the look was enough to send a shiver down her spine. After dinner, Zora made her way to the palace's vast library, determined to uncover more about this strange prophecy. She spent hours searching through ancient texts and forgotten scrolls, but nothing seemed to offer any answers. Exhausted, she sat back in her chair, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her shoulders. Suddenly, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You won't find what you're looking for in these books, Princess." Zora turned to see one of the royal advisors standing in the doorway. It was Lord Caden, the oldest and wisest of her father's counselors. His face was grave, and his eyes held a deep sorrow that she hadn't seen before. "What do you mean?" Zora asked, her curiosity piqued. "There are things, Princess, things that even the wisest among us do not understand. Your father, he has his reasons, but sometimes even the king must make choices that are not fully understood until the time is right." Zora stood up, frustration boiling inside her. "But I need to understand. Why is he doing this? What is this prophecy? Why must I marry a human?" Lord Caden's expression softened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked out, leaving Zora alone with her thoughts. The questions were piling up, but answers were still elusive. And now, more than ever, Zora knew she couldn't just sit back and accept this fate. She had to know the truth. The future of her people and the galaxy depended on it. The days grew heavier with uncertainty, and Zora's unease intensified. Her thoughts could no longer be contained within the walls of the royal palace. Each moment felt like a countdown to the inevitable marriage, yet the more she thought about it, the less she understood. It wasn't just about the humans. It was about her father, King Zorith, and the secrets he was keeping. The prophecy she had heard about, the one that had stirred something deep inside her, was the key, but she couldn't find a way to access it. Something was hidden beneath all the political maneuvering, something far darker than a simple alliance with a human. Zora spent the next few days in isolation, meeting only with her closest advisors, though she could tell they too were growing wary of the king's decree. The council had been quiet on the matter, clearly afraid to challenge the king's will, but Zora knew something had to be done. She couldn't just accept this path without understanding why her father had chosen it. The stakes were too high. Then, one night, when the rest of the palace was asleep, she made her decision. Zora would confront her father. No more whispers in the halls, no more cryptic messages. It was time to know the truth, whatever it might be. She made her way down the dimly lit corridors, the quiet whispers of the palace's silence amplifying her every step. The deeper she went into the palace, the colder it seemed to become. Finally, she reached the throne room. The door was ajar, and she could see her father sitting in his large, ornate chair, staring out at the stars through the grand windows. "Father," she called softly, but her voice echoed through the room. Zorith turned slowly, his cold gaze meeting hers. For a moment, he didn't speak, as if measuring whether he should allow her to continue. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, but Zora refused to back down. "What is it that you're hiding, Father?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. "What do you know about the humans? About this prophecy?" I need to understand. I can't live my life in the dark." Zorath's expression remained unreadable. He had always been a man of few words, but there was something different about him tonight. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if he had known that she would come to him with these questions. "The prophecy is ancient, Zora," the king said quietly, his voice tinged with a sorrow she had never heard before. "It's been passed down through our family for centuries. But the truth is, it was hidden for a reason." Zora's heart raced. "What do you mean? Why was it hidden?" The king sighed deeply, his gaze falling to the floor. "Because it is dangerous. It speaks of a human, a single human, who will rise and change the course of history. A human who will become more powerful than any of us, more dangerous than anything we've ever faced. And the only way to ensure that this human doesn't bring ruin to our empire is through a blood bond, a marriage, a union between our blood and his." Zora felt the world shift beneath her feet. Her mind was spinning, trying to comprehend the enormity of her father's words. She had always seen her father as a figure of strength, a leader who made decisions for the good of the empire. But now she saw something else. Fear. Zorath, the great king, was afraid. Afraid of a human. But how? Zora whispered, her voice barely audible. "How can one human be so powerful? How can he possibly have such an impact?" Zorath stood, his tall figure looming over her, and walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the galaxy. His voice grew softer, more pained as he spoke. "We've been watching them for a long time. The humans. They've grown in numbers and strength, and they've developed a technology we never thought possible. But it's not just their technology, Zora. It's something deeper, something inside them. A force that is unlike anything we've ever seen, and it is that force that will either save or destroy us all." Zora felt her heart skip a beat. The idea of a human, any human, being capable of such power seemed impossible. How could they, a race barely out of the primitive stage, possess something that could threaten the might of the Ivilian Empire? "You still don't understand, do you?" Zorath said, his voice distant. "It's not just about the marriage, it's about control. If we don't form this union, if we don't bind one of our bloodlines with his, the consequences will be catastrophic. The human will rise, and with him, a force greater than any of us can hope to control. The galaxy will change, Zora, and we will either stand by, or we will be swept away." Zora's mind was reeling, the weight of her father's words pressing down on her chest. A marriage to a human. Was that the only way to stop this? Was this really their only hope for survival? She couldn't shake the image of her father, the mighty king, standing before her so broken, so vulnerable. The king, a man who had led armies and conquered worlds, was now a man clinging to the belief that this strange, terrifying prophecy could save them all. Zora looked at him, her heart torn between doubt and loyalty. She had always believed in her father's wisdom, in his strength. But now she wasn't so sure. This marriage, this bond, it felt wrong. But was it the only way forward? The answers weren't clear. But Zora knew one thing for certain. The galaxy was on the brink of something far bigger than any of them had ever imagined. And she had to find out just how deep the humans' role in this prophecy truly went. Whether she wanted to or not, her destiny was now tied to it. The days that followed were filled with a sense of growing urgency. Princess Zora could feel the walls of the palace closing in on her. The decision about the marriage, the prophecy, and the fate of the galaxy were all tangled together in a knot she couldn't unravel. Her father's words echoed in her mind, haunting her at every turn. The human, this mysterious force, the power that could either save or destroy them. It was all too much to process. Zora knew she couldn't just wait for events to unfold. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Zora's first step was to find out more about this human, the one who had become the center of everything. The idea of marrying the human was still incomprehensible to her, but the more she thought about it, the more it became clear that she had little choice. If the prophecy was true, and the human did hold the power to change the galaxy, then Zora had to meet him. She had to understand what was at stake and what role he would play in her life. One evening, as she sat alone in her chambers, Zora received word that the human had arrived at the palace. Her heart raced as she read the message. Her father had ordered a formal introduction the following day. Zora felt a sense of dread settle over her. She wasn't ready for this meeting, not emotionally, not mentally, but there was no avoiding it now. The human was here, and the future was about to begin. The next day, Zora found herself standing before the grand doors of the throne room, where the human was expected to arrive. She was dressed in her royal finest, her ceremonial gown gleaming in the soft light of the palace. But despite the elegant surroundings, she couldn't help but feel out of place. The grand hall was filled with the high-ranking members of the court, the royal advisors, and all the other princesses, yet Zora's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about what her father had said. The human must marry one of you. He is the key to everything. Zora had heard stories of Earth, the primitive world where this human came from. They were a race still battling amongst themselves, plagued by war, greed, and violence. It made no sense. How could someone like this, someone so untamed and violent, be the one to change the course of the galaxy? As the doors opened, Zora's gaze immediately shifted toward the man standing at the center of the room. The human was tall, his posture straight and confident, yet there was something undeniably out of place about him. His features were strong but unrefined, his skin a shade of brown that stood out against the pale tones of the Ivilian court. His eyes, dark and intelligent, held a fire that Zora hadn't expected. There was no fear in him, no sign of inferiority. In fact, he looked more at ease than any of the Ivilians in the room. The human's presence sent a ripple of discomfort through the court, as if everyone could feel the immense power he held within him, even if they didn't yet understand it. Zora's eyes locked with his for a moment, and she felt a strange pull, a curiosity she hadn't expected. Was this the man who would change everything? Was this the one who would bring balance, or destruction, to the galaxy? The human was introduced to the court, and Zora watched with a mixture of fascination and suspicion as her father spoke to him with a kind of reverence that was rare for anyone, let alone someone of such lowly origins. Zora couldn't help but notice the way the king treated the human, as though he were the most important person in the room. The royal advisors spoke in hushed tones, their expressions tense, as if they, too, understood the gravity of the moment. When it was time for Zora to be introduced to the human, she took a deep breath. She had prepared herself for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the way her heart raced when she walked toward him. Her eyes met his once more, and this time she couldn't look away. There was something in those eyes, something she couldn't place, something that felt both alien and familiar. "You must be Princess Zora," the human said, his voice low and steady. There was no bowing, no deference, just a simple statement. His tone was casual, but there was a strength behind it, a quiet confidence that made Zora's heart beat faster. "I am," she replied, her voice betraying none of the uncertainty she felt. "And you are the human from Earth." "I am," he answered with a slight smile, his lips curling just enough to reveal a hint of humor. "Though unsure, Earth doesn't make much of an impression on you." Zora felt an odd sense of amusement, despite the gravity of the situation. "No, not much, but then again, nothing about this situation is what I expected." The human's eyes softened, and for a moment, Zora saw something in them, a vulnerability, perhaps, something that suggested he, too, was out of his depth in this strange galaxy. "I didn't expect to be here, either," he said quietly. "But sometimes fate works in strange ways." Zora didn't know how to respond to that. Fate was something the Ivilians had never truly believed in, but there was something about the human's words that felt significant. Could it be that his arrival, his presence in the royal court, was part of something much larger than even her father understood? The meeting was short, and soon the human was escorted away by the royal guards, leaving Zora standing in the middle of the room, her thoughts racing. She couldn't deny that there was something about him, something that both intrigued and unsettled her. The prophecy, her father's decree, the marriage. It was all beginning to feel like a puzzle with pieces she couldn't yet fit together. As she left the throne room, Zora couldn't help but wonder, was the human really the key to everything? Or was he just another pawn in a much larger game? One thing was certain: her life, and the fate of the galaxy, was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The days following her first meeting with the human felt like a whirlwind to Zora. Each passing hour was filled with confusion and doubt, but also an undeniable pull to learn more. The human was unlike any being she had ever encountered. His presence was strange yet compelling, and despite her initial reluctance, she found herself thinking about him more and more. What did it mean for her kingdom, and for the galaxy? Her father, King Zorath, had told her that the prophecy was the key to everything, that the human was a necessary ally, the one who could either save or destroy them all. But Zora couldn't ignore the nagging questions that plagued her mind. Why had the human been chosen? What was it about him that made him so special? And most troubling of all, why did her father insist on the marriage? One evening, as Zora stood by her window looking out over the vast Ivelian palace grounds, she made a decision. She could no longer sit idly by and let fate determine her future. If she was to marry this human, she needed to understand him, to know who he really was, and what role he would play in the galaxy's future. She couldn't rely solely on her father's cryptic words. Zora had to seek the truth for herself. That night, after dinner, she sneaked away from the royal chambers. The palace was quieter than usual, and the corridors were empty, save for the occasional guard. Zora made her way to the human's quarters, her steps swift but deliberate. She had no plan other than to speak with him directly, to ask him the questions he needed answered. The guards at his door gave her a wary look, but they knew better than to question the princess. They stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Inside, the human was sitting at a desk, studying something that looked like a map of the galaxy. He looked up when she entered, his face betraying little surprise, as if he had been expecting her. Zora felt a flush of embarrassment, but pushed it aside. She had to be brave. "You're awake late," she said, trying to sound casual. The human stood and nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "I could say the same to you, princess, but I'm not complaining." Zora ignored his teasing tone. "I didn't come here for pleasantries," she said bluntly. "I came to ask you about the prophecy, about what you're really here to do." The human's smile faded. He set the map down and walked toward her, his gaze steady. "I'm not sure what you want me to say," he replied, his voice low and serious. "I'm just a man, a human. I've been thrust into this situation just as much as you have." Zora's heart skipped a beat. "But you don't understand. My father believes you're the key to everything. He says you're the only one who can save or destroy us all. Why? Why are you so important?" The human paused, his expression hardening as if he were considering how much to reveal. "I don't know why your father thinks that," he said after a long moment. "But I do know this. There's something about humans, something you don't understand yet. We're not like the other species in the galaxy. We don't have your technology, your power, your centuries of wisdom, but we have something else. We have survival instincts. We have resilience. And above all, we have an unyielding drive to fight for what's ours." Zora's mind raced. She had heard of the humans' persistence, their tendency to fight back against any odds, but she hadn't understood its significance. Now she was beginning to see the flicker of something more profound. "Your people fight," Zora said slowly, "but you don't have the strength of the Ivelians. You don't have the power we've developed over centuries. So why do you think that you could stand against us? Against the galaxy?" The human took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers with a fierce intensity. "It's not about standing against you. It's about standing with you. The prophecy doesn't say that the human will come to fight you. It says that the human will come to change things, to unite the galaxy. I don't know how or why, but I believe it's true. And I think that's what your father is afraid of." Zora stood there in stunned silence, processing his words. Change. Unite. She had never imagined that this man, this human, could be the one to bring such an impossible shift to the galaxy. The idea seemed absurd, but the more she thought about it, the more it began to make sense. Maybe the Ivilians weren't the only ones with power. Maybe the humans, despite their rawness and perceived weakness, possessed something far more dangerous, a power that couldn't be controlled or predicted. "If you truly believe in this prophecy," Zora finally said, her voice quieter, "then why are you here? Why are you following my father's orders? He wants to use you, control you." The human's face softened slightly. "Because I don't have a choice," he admitted. "I didn't come here willingly. But I also know that if I refuse, if I don't play my part, the galaxy will fall into chaos. And maybe, just maybe, this marriage, this union between our bloodlines, is the only way to stop that from happening." Zora's thoughts were swirling, and she felt both terrified and compelled by his words. Was it possible? Was this really the path to peace, or was it the beginning of something much darker? Her heart told her that the human might be right. There was something different about him, something beyond the surface of his raw power. But how could she trust him? How could she trust anything anymore? Before she could say another word, the door to the room burst open, and Zora's father entered, flanked by his guards. His expression was unreadable as he looked between his daughter and the human. "I see you've been getting to know each other," King Zorath said, his voice cold and calculating. "But remember, Princess, this marriage is no mere formality. It's the only way to protect our empire, and you will do your duty." Zora met her father's eyes, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what the future held, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her destiny, and the destiny of the galaxy, was now tied to the human before her. Whatever happened next, she would face it head-on. There was no turning back now.